The orphan bear who was raised by humans and never left. Part 1. The Lost Cub. The forest was silent except for the gentle rustling of the leaves as the wind whispered through the towering pines. The golden hues of autumn painted the landscape, signaling the arrival of colder days ahead. Deep within this vast wilderness, something small and fragile moved through the undergrowth, alone, weak, and afraid. A bear cub, barely a few months old, stumbled clumsily over fallen branches and thick patches of moss. Its fur was matted, its ribs faintly visible beneath its soft coat, and its eyes, wide with fear, darted in every direction. It was searching for food, for shelter, for its mother, but its mother would not return. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, something had gone terribly wrong, whether she had been taken by hunters or lost to a predator. The cub would never know. All it knew was hunger, the gnawing emptiness that had driven it from the den where it had waited for days, hoping she would come back. Now, exhaustion pressed against its tiny frame. Its legs trembled with each step, its breath coming in short, weak pants. It was not made to survive alone, and if the cold didn't claim it, starvation surely would. But fate had other plans. Not far from where the cub wandered, a small homestead sat nestled at the edge of the forest. It was a modest house, built from sturdy logs, with smoke curling from the stone chimney. A wooden fence surrounded a modest garden, and beyond that, fields stretched toward the horizon. This was home to Daniel and Sarah Whitaker, a couple who had long since chosen the quiet of nature over the chaos of city life. On this particular afternoon, Sarah had stepped outside to gather herbs from her garden when a movement near the tree line caught her attention. She squinted, shielding her eyes from the sun. At first, she thought it was a stray dog, lost and hungry, but as she took a few cautious steps forward, realization struck her. It was a bear cub. Her heart clenched at the sight. It was far too young to be alone. Where was its mother? Why was it so thin? The poor thing looked half-starved, its tiny frame shaking as it sniffed at the air, barely able to stay on its feet. "Daniel," she called, her voice urgent but soft. Within moments, her husband appeared on the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What is it?" She pointed toward the cub. "Look." Daniel followed her gaze and frowned. He had spent years in these woods, hunting, tracking, understanding the rhythms of the land, and he knew right away, this cub had no family left. It wouldn't survive the night on its own. "We can't just leave it," Sarah whispered, her heart aching for the tiny creature. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his beard. He knew what she meant. Raising a wild animal was not just difficult, it was dangerous. But looking at the cub, at the way it wobbled weakly as it tried to move forward, he knew there was only one choice. Slowly, carefully, he stepped toward it. The cub lifted its head, its little black nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It did not run. Perhaps it was too tired to. "It's okay, little one," Daniel murmured, crouching down and extending his hand. The cub hesitated, then, as if surrendering, took a wobbly step forward before collapsing entirely. A soft whimper escaped its throat. Sarah's breath hitched. "Daniel, I know." Without another word, he carefully scooped the cub into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, barely more than skin and bones beneath its thick fur. As he carried it toward the house, Sarah hurried ahead, already preparing a space by the hearth, her mind racing with what they would need to do. Warmth, food, shelter. They couldn't know then that this single act of kindness would change their lives forever. Inside, the cub lay curled on a blanket beside the fire, its small body finally still, save for the soft rise and fall of its breathing. Sarah knelt beside it, gently wiping away bits of dirt and leaves from its fur. "What do we feed it?" she asked, looking up at Daniel. He sighed. "Warm milk for now. Maybe a bit of honey if we have any left." Sarah nodded and rushed to the kitchen, returning minutes later with a small bowl of warm milk mixed with crushed berries. She dipped the cloth into the liquid and brought it to the cub's mouth. At first, it didn't respond. Then, weakly, it flicked out its tongue, tasting the milk. Encouraged, Sarah continued, letting the cub drink in slow, careful sips. After a few minutes, Its breathing grew steadier, its tiny body relaxing ever so slightly. Daniel watched from the chair beside them, his arms crossed. This isn't going to be easy. Sarah looked up at him, determination in her eyes. No, but we couldn't just leave it to die. He sighed, shaking his head with a soft chuckle. You always had a way of bringing home strays. She smiled. This one's a little bigger than a cat, I'll admit. The cub gave a small, barely audible grunt, a noise that almost sounded like approval. Daniel smirked. Guess we're in this together. Then, and just like that, the orphan bear had found a new family. The first few days were uncertain. The bear cub, whom Sarah had taken to calling Benji, remained weak and wary. Though it no longer trembled with hunger, it still eyed its surroundings with hesitation. As if unsure whether this strange new home was truly safe, Sarah and Daniel moved cautiously around their new guest, understanding that trust would take time. They had raised animals before, stray dogs, orphan deer, even an injured hawk once. But this was different. This was a wild bear, and no matter how small or vulnerable it seemed now, one day, it would grow into a powerful predator. Still, Sarah couldn't help but be drawn to the little creature. She would sit beside the hearth, speaking to Benji in soft tones as she fed him warm milk and crushed berries. Each day, he ate more, his strength returning little by little. He no longer flinched when she reached out to touch him, and by the end of the week, he had stopped shying away from Daniel's presence as well. He's getting used to us, Sarah observed one morning as she watched the cub paw curiously at a wooden spoon she had left on the floor. Daniel, leaning against the counter, gave a small grunt. That's what worries me. Sarah frowned. Why? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He's not a pet, Sarah. He's a wild animal. The more he gets used to us, the harder it'll be for him to survive when we send him back into the wild. Sarah's expression softened. I know that, but right now, he needs us. And when the time comes, we'll do what's best for him. Daniel didn't argue. He knew she was right. They had no choice but to care for the cub. But in the back of his mind, he wondered if they were making it harder for him to leave when the time came. Part 3. Returning to the wild. One afternoon, while tending to her garden, Sarah noticed Benji watching her with keen interest. She plucked a ripe berry and held it out to him. The cub sniffed it before gently taking it from her hand, chewing with obvious delight. As the snow melted and the first signs of spring emerged, the reality of what needed to happen became impossible to ignore. Benji was no longer a small, helpless cub. He had grown into a strong young bear, his muscles more defined, his instincts sharpening. Sarah and Daniel knew it was time to start preparing him for the life he was meant to live. You like that, huh? She mused. Sarah watched as Benji paced near the door, his nose twitching at the scents carried in by the wind. He no longer fit inside the cabin comfortably, his size and strength making it clear that he didn't belong within human walls. The forest was calling to him, and they couldn't deny it any longer. Over the next few days, Benji followed her outside more often, curiously watching as she worked the soil and picked fresh produce. He sniffed at vegetables, pawed at fallen leaves, and even tried to climb the fence, much to Daniel's exasperation. One afternoon, Daniel took Benji on his first real outing into the deeper parts of the forest. He carried a bag of food, knowing that Benji still depended on them for nourishment, but he also wanted to encourage the young bear to forage. Sarah watched from the porch as they disappeared into the trees, her heart heavy with the understanding that each trip was bringing them closer to goodbye. He's getting too comfortable, Daniel muttered one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the cub wrestle with a burlap sack. Soon, he's going to be too big to keep inside. Daniel led Benji to a small clearing where wild berries and roots grew in abundance. He set the food down and watched as the bear sniffed the ground, his large paws pressing into the soft earth. Benji was hesitant at first, unsure of what he was supposed to do, but slowly, his instincts guided him. He pawed at the dirt, uncovering edible roots, and licked at the berries hanging from the bushes. Sarah sighed. I know, but he's still too young to be on his own. You're getting there, buddy, Daniel muttered, watching with a mix of pride and sadness. Daniel glanced at her. How do we know when it's time? Over the next few weeks, the trips became more frequent. They took Benji farther into the wilderness, staying with him for hours at a time, then slowly increasing the length of time he spent alone. It was a delicate balance, teaching him to be independent without making him feel abandoned. Sarah didn't have an answer. She just knew that, for now, Benji wasn't ready to leave. Found it harder than she expected. Each time Benji left, she feared he wouldn't return. She knew that was the goal, but the thought of never seeing him again was unbearable. Then, one morning, it happened. Winter arrived, blanketing the land in thick layers of snow. The cabin was warm, the fire constantly burning, and Benji had grown significantly since they first found him. His once thin, fragile body was now sturdy and covered in thick fur. He had learned to climb onto furniture, much to Daniel's annoyance, and had even begun responding to Sarah's voice when she called him Benji didn't come back. But there was one thing that never changed. His eyes always held a longing when he looked outside. Sarah stood by the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, scanning the tree line as she had done every morning since they started the process. But this time, there was no familiar shape emerging from the shadows, no heavy footsteps padding toward the cabin. It was a reminder that no matter how comfortable he had become, the wilderness still called to him. Daniel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's ready," he said softly. One evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Daniel sat across from Sarah at the dinner table. "Come spring, we need to start teaching him how to be a bear again." Sarah swallowed hard, blinking against the sting of tears. "I know." Sarah nodded, though the thought of saying goodbye weighed heavily on her heart. She had known from the start that this day would come. They spent the following days in quiet acceptance, adjusting to the absence of the bear who had become part of their family. Life moved on, the forest continuing its endless cycle. The garden needed tending, the river called for fishing, and the routine of survival carried them forward. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that even after being returned to the wild, Benji would never truly leave them. Just when they had accepted that Benji was gone for good, something incredible happened. One early summer evening, as Sarah was watering the plants, she felt an odd sensation, a presence, familiar yet unexpected. Slowly, she turned toward the trees, and there he was. Benji stood at the edge of the forest, watching her with those same deep, intelligent eyes. He had grown even more, his fur thick and glossy, his muscles even stronger. But there was no hesitation in his stance, no confusion. He had come back. Sarah dropped the watering can, rushing forward before stopping just short of him. Benji let out a low, rumbling chuff, a sound she had come to recognize as his way of greeting. Tears welled in her eyes as she smiled. "You didn't forget us, did you?" Daniel appeared in the doorway, staring in disbelief. "I'll be damned." Benji didn't stay long. He sniffed the air, rubbed his massive head against Sarah's outstretched hand one last time, then turned and padded back into the forest. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, looking at Daniel with a mix of amazement and relief. "He's free," she whispered, "but he still remembers." Daniel nodded, watching the place where the bear had disappeared. "Looks like we'll be seeing him again." And they did, every year. When the seasons shifted and the forest came alive again, Benji would return, sometimes for a brief visit, sometimes for longer, but always to the place he had once called home. Part 5, a legacy that lives on. Brutus had lived an extraordinary life, one that defied expectations, changed perceptions, and touched the hearts of thousands. For over a decade, he remained a central part of Casey's world, an ambassador for his species and a symbol of what true companionship between humans and animals could look like. But time is an unstoppable force, even for the strongest of creatures. As the years passed, Brutus's once powerful frame grew slower, his playful energy softened by age. His fur, once thick and dark, carried streaks of silver, and his movements became more deliberate, more thoughtful. Casey knew his friend was entering his twilight years, and he made sure every moment was filled with care, love, and dignity. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low over the Montana landscape, Brutus lay by the pond, watching the golden hues shimmer on the water's surface. Casey sat beside him, resting a hand on the bear's massive shoulder. "You've done more than I ever could have imagined. Buddy," he murmured, "you changed the world." Brutus let out a deep sigh, his eyes soft and knowing. Though he could not speak, there was something in his gaze that told Casey he understood. Not long after, Brutus passed peacefully, surrounded by the land he called home and the man who had loved him since the day he was rescued. His loss was deeply felt, not just by Casey, but by the countless people whose lives he had touched through his story. Brutus's impact on the world. Though Brutus was gone, his legacy remained. His story continued to inspire, educate, and ignite passion for wildlife conservation. The sanctuary Casey built in his honor expanded, providing a haven for other rescued bears and wild animals in need. His influence reached classrooms, documentaries, and conservation efforts worldwide, proving that one bear could make a difference in how people saw his species. Casey continued his work, sharing Brutus's story whenever he could. "He wasn't just a bear," he would say. "He was my best friend, and he showed the world that bears, like all creatures, deserve respect, love, and understanding." People from all over visited the sanctuary, some just to see where Brutus had lived, others to carry on his mission of wildlife preservation. His paw prints remained imprinted not just in the dirt of Montana, but in the hearts of those who believed in a world where humans and animals could coexist in harmony. The spirit of Brutus lives on. On quiet evenings, Casey still found himself looking out toward the woods, half expecting to see his old friend watching from the tree line. And in many ways, Brutus never truly left. His spirit lived on in the sanctuary, in the stories told around campfires, in the lessons he had taught about kindness, coexistence, and the undeniable bond between man and nature. One night, as Casey sat by the pond, he thought he heard a familiar chuff in the wind, a soft sound carrying through the trees. He smiled, looking up at the stars. "Good night, buddy." Brutus may have been gone, but his story, his impact, would never fade.